Do you know how much capital I've invested in Bitcoin at this point, Raoul?
What I'd love to dig in to start with, since then, what are your learnings? What have you learned about the whole space? Because as we all know, this is a kind of hugely evolving situation and we kind of are figuring things out as we go. So what didn't you know then that you kind of know now?
Well, I think in every month for the past 13 months, there have been positive developments that give us more confidence in Bitcoin. The result of the election was a positive development. The regulatory regime, I think, is a positive development. I think we had 0 public companies holding Bitcoin before Microstrategy, and now there's like 25 maybe. If you want to see Bitcoin go to $10 million a coin, then it won't come from 125x or 20x offshore levered contracts and traders. It will come from insurance companies and macro hedge funds that have capital, $100 billion of capital, and they just allocate 5% of it to Bitcoin forever. I think in general, the bullish developments of the past 12 months have been institutional adoption of Bitcoin, and that has come in the form of the companies, the Squares, the Teslas, the Microstrategies, the Marathons, the Riots of the world that are actually in the space. I think that the second thing that I've been a big proponent of, a big cheerleader of, is if you're going to be in the Bitcoin mining business, then you're naturally long Bitcoin, and if you're naturally long Bitcoin, it's inconsistent to ever sell it. So if you're a Bitcoin miner and Bitcoin goes to 0, your business is worth 0. Do you know how much capital I've invested in Bitcoin at this point, Raoul?
No.
$3,335 million.
Yeah, and you've been championing this by just using the word property more, trying to anchor people on thinking of it as a digital property. Is that what you're trying to do there, to get people to start thinking of it in those terms?
I think that there's 3 metaphors for Bitcoin, and I think one metaphor is digital property. We're demonetizing the monetary premium in your commercial real estate, your residential real estate, your gold, your silver, your commodities. There's a lot of things that have been monetized, right? I mean, in Canada, they've got the current example where the prime minister thinks the foreigners have monetized all the houses in Canada, so they cost so much that nobody can afford a house. So digital property is the ideal property. It's the most desirable property in space and time. Bitcoin is the dominant digital property network. It's the most secure. It has the most durability. It's the most decentralized. So therefore, if you said to me, where do I put my $1 billion such that any rich person on earth will want it, and any rich person in the next 100 years will want it? Bitcoin. The second check is, if you have to hold it 100 years, a building doesn't have a 100-year lifespan. The Rockefeller Center, or another way to say it, it's got a maintenance charge. You have to reinvest 3 to 5% a year every year for 100 years in order to maintain a building. And even if you do that, name one building in New York City that's 150 years old that's commercially viable today. The useful life of a building, not that great. How about the land underneath the building? Better. Buy blocks of New York City, and that'll be good for a while, but you've got a property tax on it. The property tax, and you've got the risk of seizure by eminent domain. So, and you've got the meddling of the neighborhood zoning board. They can zone your 10 blocks to be low density.
Yeah.
Or they can zone it to be high density, and high density makes it worth $50 million a block, and low density makes it worth $1 million a block. So imagine having the neighborhood, the mayor, the governor, every regulator in the United States, the White House, and Congress all deciding whether or not they will impair your asset or your property every year for the next 100 years.
So could they impair Bitcoin the same way to give it a carry cost? So there's a holding tax that you have to pay every year of 3% in line with property. I mean, that's likely to happen right over time.
The basic principle is this, Raoul. Bitcoin is the apex property of the human race. It's the hardest to impair.
Yeah.
It's the hardest to seize. It's the hardest to tax. It's the easiest to move. It's the easiest to keep confidential. You can subdivide it. Take your 10 acres of property in New York City, or your 10 city blocks in New York City, divide it into 97,000 pieces, and then rent it out to 97,000 people that live somewhere outside of New York City every hour. I can oscillate the property at 60 megahertz. I can move it at any frequency. I can subdivide it, in any partition. And if New York wanted to tax it, I can move it to Wyoming. And I think if you come back to Bitcoin as digital property, you can move it, unlike land. Yeah. How do you move the domicile of Apple headquarters? You've seen the Apple headquarters. That's not moving, right? So you can't move the domicile of a corporation. You can't move a factory. You can't move land in Kansas. You can't move a city block in New York. You can't move the Rockefeller Center. Okay, can you move $1 billion of gold? Theoretically, but practically no, right? It would take you 6 months. Try smuggling $1 billion worth of gold through the airport. It's not easy, maybe in theory, but they can pass a law making it difficult to move the gold. So, Bitcoin, I can move it. It's hard to confiscate. It's hard to tax. But let's say, Raoul, let's come back to this tax issue. I'm an American citizen, and no state's going to get it. No municipality's going to be able to tax it. Miami taxes my property 2%, or Florida does. I can't move my house, but I can move my Bitcoin out of Florida. But let's say that, you're really focused, right? And Congress passes a law saying every American must pay 2% a year to own Bitcoin. Okay, let's get to the extreme. Well, they're going to tax everything else first, right? That wealth tax they've already basically put a property tax on every piece of property in every state in the country. So eventually, let's say they get to that point. And let's say that they combine that with you have to give up your passport, pay an exit tax, and live out of the country for a decade before you can duck that. Okay, fair enough, right? That was, you kind of got me there. But having said it, I can sell the property. Okay, so if I hold Bitcoin in the U.S. as a U.S. citizen at 2% a year for 50 years, okay, I'm going to pay 100% of the asset value of the Bitcoin. Having said all that, there's a person in Singapore that still will want to own $1 billion of Bitcoin. Sell your $1 billion building in Manhattan to the person in Singapore when they put a 2% tax on the building in Manhattan. The point is, you don't have the option to sell it. It's not going to be that useful. Bitcoin, you could think of it as digital property, but you can also think of it as digital energy. Mm-hmm. And if you think of it as digital energy, right, all energy becomes matter. All matter can become energy. There's conservation of them. You can neither create nor destroy that, right? I can take money, $1 billion of money, turn it into $1 billion of energy, turn it into $1 billion of products and services, turn it into $1 billion of property. All of these things are fungible in a socioeconomic system. If Bitcoin is digital energy, then what's special about it is what happens if I mine Bitcoin, take an S19 miner, put it on a megawatt of power, convert it to Bitcoin. I've converted electrical energy into digital energy. It's worth $4 million of Bitcoin on an S19 miner. An S19 miner will spit out about $1 million worth of Bitcoin. Now, what happens after I've digitized the energy? It'll last forever. Can I move $4 million worth of Bitcoin, move it to Tokyo? Well, 2 days ago, someone moved $2 billion of Bitcoin for 78 cents, Raoul.